Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about Guantanamo Bay, the prison there, if you can call it that, detention camp, and why it ought to be closed. Now, amidst all these drone strikes, sanctions, threats to world peace, many people seem to have forgotten that people have been held without trial or charge in Guantanamo Bay since January 2002. So here we are, 16 years on, coming up for 17, and some people still there, which is an absolute disgrace. And they have held there with dubious legality. So it's an ongoing scandal that people have been deprived of their liberty for so long, not being proved guilty of any crime whatsoever, and being taken there from the far side of the globe without a legal process, without an extradition hearing or anything like that, and really no end in sight. And Donald Trump has said he plans to keep them there forever. No plan to ever regularize the situation, to ever give them their day in court, to argue their case. Hello, Brett Garside. So it's a moral outrage that this is going on. And obviously the United States needs to be called out over this, should be hauled over the coals for doing this. And then it really is staggering that the US government has the impudence to lecture the rest of the world on human rights, on liberty, when it's doing this, and has been doing it for years. And the actual terrorist threat to the United States is really not that great. I mean, since 9/11, how many people have been killed in the United States in terrorist incidents? Is it 100, something like that? Almost entirely by white supremacist terrorism, not Islamist terrorism. But why do we hear about that so much? Why do American politicians almost never address the threat, which is white supremacist terrorism? So, to cast your mind back to 9/11, to 2001, the attack on the World Trade Tower, in which 3,000 people were killed, almost every single one of them civilians killed by Al-Qaeda, crashing planes into buildings. 3,000 people were killed. George W. Bush said that the world had changed. Now, it was not the first time that 3,000 people have been killed. It certainly hasn't been the last time that 3,000 people have been killed, including civilians. But why did the world never change in another incident when 3,000 people were killed? Why has it never changed with all the hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed in conflicts ever since, particularly civilians? So the United States proclaimed its war on terror, but all too often this turned out to be a war on civil liberty. George W. Bush, he invoked a state of emergency. He signed executive orders mandating people to be locked up without trial or charge, various civilians in the United States. Now, after a few months, that was regularized. They either had hearings or they were released. Flights were grounded. All sorts of emergency measures were enacted. Obviously, military reservists were called away from their civilian jobs, things like that. Waterboarding was soon introduced. So the president and the US military, they authorized this sort of mistreatment. What sort of severe mistreatment of civilians was, suspects was to be allowed. As in, so obviously tied up, a bag over your head, water poured over your head, and it simulates drowning. So is that torture? Arguably. Even if it's not torture, it's certainly inhuman and degrading treatment. Look at the Convention Against Torture, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment, or CAT for short, signed in 1979 by the United States, ardently promoted by the United States every year, which compiles human rights reports denouncing various governments for their transgressions. But this certainly causes severe mental or physical suffering. The feeling that you're going to drown. When are they going to stop pouring the water on? What if they go too far? You could well drown. The idea is then the suspect will sing like a canary, and he or she is going to reveal everything that he or she knows. But now, the United States deserves a certain modicum of credit for at least being truthful about what it's up to, because many other governments torture, but not so many of them are so frank or perhaps so shameless as Uncle Sam to proclaim exactly what they're doing. And perhaps as a way of trying to scare America's enemies, because if we catch you, this is what we're going to do to you. But doesn't that make people less likely to want to surrender and more likely to fight to the death, thereby causing more casualties on both sides? If you wish to induce people to surrender, you would like them to know that they will be treated decently and make surrender as attractive an option as possible. Otherwise, they're going to fight to the bitter end. No point in surrendering because they'll be treated cruelly and are going to take as many of the enemy down with me on my way. So the US supposedly is starting to try to regulate and limit the abuse that will be meted out to prisoners. However, suppose American troops fall into the hands of an enemy and the enemy started waterboarding them. Would the US government say that was entirely legal and ethical to waterboard these people? I suspect not. So why not? if it's sauce for the goose, it's sauce for the gander. If it's acceptable for the United States to do it to foreigners, it must be acceptable for foreigners to do it to people from the United States. Okay, it's got to go both ways. It's got to be reciprocity. So I wonder how they'd feel when the boot was on the other foot. Unless you're going to argue that Americans are the master race, which a few people in the United States seem to believe. So after 9/11, the United States invoked that article, the NATO Charter, which declares that an attack on one NATO state is an attack on all. And that obliges the other NATO states to come to the aid of the countries under attack. Now, many of these other countries have been in conflicts, international domestic conflicts. I mean, the French didn't invoke this with regard to Indochina or Algeria being French sovereign territory at the time. The United Kingdom did not invoke this in relation to Northern Ireland or the Falklands and so on. But anyway, only the United States did, and all other NATO countries, they dutifully dispatched troops to Afghanistan to assist the United States. So the NATO troops were fighting there. They included Turks, Muslims almost without exception, several other Muslim countries which weren't NATO countries. They sent troops to help the United States. America's ally in Afghanistan was the United Islamic Front, better known as the Northern Alliance. The United Islamic Front was not quite as reactionary as the Taliban. Anyway, but despite all this, some American politicians indulge in the most vile Islamophobic rhetoric and demagoguery, despite so many Muslims being on their side. Anyway, so the US was fighting the Taliban, which ruled over 90% of Afghanistan at the time. These were medieval theocrats who presided over a viciously oppressive system. It was a dark night for those who cared for liberty. It was terrible for women and so on. Now, the Taliban had been built up by America's ally in the region, Pakistan. So the ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence, the Pakistani ISI had done so much to assist the Taliban, fund them, arm them, train them, provide them with intelligence. So during that time, when the Taliban rose to power, the United States was furnishing Pakistan with billions of dollars of military aid, with weapons and so forth. Now, only a complete nincompoop would believe that Pakistan didn't hand any of this on to the Taliban. So the Taliban was monstrous in many regards. It did at least interdict the heroin trade. But anyway, the US policy in the region was at best short-sighted. And then we saw blowback. The sky was full of chickens coming home to roost. The US had helped to create this golem, which then ran amok. So America had to slay its own Frankenstein. Anyway, so in 2001, the United States and her allies, they bested Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in many engagements. Some Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters fell into American hands. So what to do with these prisoners if they were not to be summarily executed? So the United States didn't want to call them prisoners of war, because that would accord these detainees certain rights pursuant to the Geneva Convention. Now, the Geneva Convention is applicable not only in a declared war, but in a warlike situation. As there is an army on one side, there are armed people on another side. If that's not a warlike situation, I don't know what is. George W. Bush repeatedly said it was a war. Field McConnell, Sister Conair. Hello. I don't know what that's a reference to, the film. The Taliban was a state in all but formal designation. I mean, several other sovereign states have recognized the Taliban as the rightful government of Afghanistan. So it's very arguable that it really was a declared war. Hello, Adam Clark, applauding. So the United States didn't want to go down the prisoner of war route. So there was another option. They could treat these people as suspects who were arrested and prepare a criminal case against them, charge them with offenses. But that would also have entitled these prisoners to certain rights, to habeas corpus, to a fair trial, and so on, to meetings with their lawyer and confidentiality. But the United States didn't want to do that one either. So they wanted to have the best of both worlds, be able to hold these guys as long as possible, as though they're prisoners of war, but no trials. Okay. So instead, they came up with a legal novelty. They decided they were battlefield detainees, so neither prisoners of war nor suspects arrested awaiting trial. So the USA wanted to be free of any legal obligations towards the men and boys it captured. And when I say boys, I really do mean minors. Some of them were well below the age of 18. So it is staggering that the United States took children from the far side of the world and flew them to the United States without so much as an extradition hearing, without any consideration for their juvenile status. So would the United States accept its children being grabbed off the street by agents of a foreign country and flown halfway across the world? I think not. Imagine if Iran did this. if Iranian soldiers were in the United States, abducted American children and flew them to Iran, having, of course, stripped them, which raises child protection concerns. There could be pedophiles abusing them, deriving some sort of perverse gratification from seeing them nude, hooding them and sedating them. So people drugged up to their eyeballs and then flown to Guantanamo Bay. So you can imagine the moral indignation, the outrage if Iran, for instance, did this to American children. The United States did not want to bring these people to the United States proper. Why not? Because once they're in the United States, they are accorded certain constitutional rights. These privileges are afforded not just to American citizens, but to foreigners who are in the United States, legally or illegally. So the US government didn't want to go down that road because they'd be guaranteed certain rights. So this was extraordinary rendition. There was no extradition hearing. What is the legal basis for moving them from one country to another if they're not prisoners of war? Prisoners of war, all right, sometimes you capture them in the battle and then you send them to somewhere else, further away from the battle, another country, to make it more difficult to escape. So taking them to this other country, to Guantanamo Bay, was surely illegal. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that is. So the Bush administration did not want to be hamstrung by constitutional niceties. Prisoners were sent to Guantanamo Bay, as we know. Now we're told that Guantanamo Bay is not part of the United States, which is true. But for all intents and purposes, it's been run as though it is part of the United States for over 100 years. Remember when the United States arrested Cuba from Spain? Obviously, Spain was the lawful government of Cuba, like it or not. And the US obviously sponsored that rebellion, which you could say was a terrible interference in Spain's internal affairs. Anyhow, so the United States ran Cuba for a few years, and it granted at least nominal independence to Cuba, but with the proviso that the United States must be allowed to control Guantanamo Bay in perpetuity. And the Cuban government agreed to that. If they hadn't agreed to that, they wouldn't have got independence. So that's under duress, really. And then the US had to pay a peppercorn rent to Cuba. Now, hello, Able Danger to find Fidel McConnell. I don't know, do you mean Mitch McConnell? So anyway, since Fidel Castro became president in 1959, he pretty soon said, wait a second, I want Guantanamo Bay back. Cuba, we don't agree, the United States ruling Guantanamo Bay. And the US government has unsurprisingly told them to bog off. And the US offers like $100 or something each year to Cuba in rent, and the Cuban government refuses it, saying you've got no right to be there. So if it is Cuban territory and the Cubans demand it back, give it back. All right. But if it's not Cuban territory, if it's American territory and you don't have to give it back to the Cubans, well, then you have to apply US law there. You can't have it both ways, that it's both Cuban and not Cuban at the same time. Well, it's both American and not American simultaneously. So here we are. The idea that it's not sovereign territory rests on this de minimis argument that technically it's not part of the United States. But anyway, we've seen how that is highly problematic, to say the least. So Guantanamo Bay is all but is American in all but the most theoretical legal sense, and this very thin argument is used to deprive the people there of their constitutional entitlements. And there's a case, a precedent for this centuries ago, an English case, and obviously American jurists, they sometimes look to cases from England from bygone centuries, since their legal system is common law and is obviously predicated on these precedents in numerous cases. Well, some prisoners were supposed to be taken overseas, and some guy, instead of taking them to the American continent, he took them to Lundy Island, which is just off the coast of England. And then he said that's okay. They said, no, that doesn't count. I know, strictly speaking, it is overseas, but it has to be in a real sense, or keeping people on ships so they couldn't have their rights. Only on land do rights apply. No, that argument has no merit. Court struck it down. So the idea that we don't bring to the United States as such, therefore they don't have any rights, that is legally a nullity. So what is the evidence against those who are detained, that they're supposedly terrorists? Well, they happen to be in the general area where the US military was operating. They're just grabbed in some cases. Now, they could be Al-Qaeda operatives, they could be Taliban fighters, they could be terrorists, but prove it. It's up to you to prove it. There's a presumption of innocence. Some of them were just swept up. Some of them were found to be in possession of firearms. It's not a crime to possess a firearm. It's as normal to carry a gun in Afghanistan as it is in Alabama. Again, I give my example of Iranian soldiers coming to the United States. Anybody we see with a gun, right, grabbed, and we're just going to take you to the far side of the world and hold you for decades without trial or charge. So they are hostages. So the battlefield detainees, as I said, in Afghanistan, they were hooded and sedated. Now, hooding is very controversial indeed. The United Kingdom outlawed the hooding of suspects in 1972. And when the British Army was hooding people, the US government castigated the British Army for its supposed abuse of human rights. As I say, the UK hasn't done so in 47 years. But the United States is still doing so. It shows how the United Kingdom has got an enviable human rights record, far better than that of the United States. So oddly, I've never heard of any American politician denouncing the US military for hooding people in all these intervening years. So the suspects were flown to Guantanamo Bay. And as I say, I don't think there's any legal footing for doing that. But if there was a prima facie case for charging these men of various crimes, men and boys, it ought to be done under Afghan law, because it was principally in Afghanistan that any alleged crimes would have taken place. And the United States recognized the United Islamic Front as the rightful government of Afghanistan. There are courts in Afghanistan, there are judges, there are prisons. They could be tried under that system. The United Islamic Front, as it was, always held the UN seat for Afghanistan. They were the legitimate government. But the Afghan government's not been permitted to try these people, whether they're Afghan citizens or not. They were present in Afghanistan. So the suspects were grossly abused, as I have now established. The United States has legalized inhuman and degrading treatment, which many people would call torture. And remember, the United States was one of the prime movers behind the Convention Against Torture, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment. It has so often castigated other countries for supposedly breaching its obligations under the same, and sometimes rightly so. Again, it is something which smacks the most staggering arrogance and hypocrisy not to apply these standards that the US insists it apply to others. Lead by example. Show us what human rights are. And incidentally, the Convention Against Torture says that no national emergency, no level of threat, no exigency makes it acceptable to derogate from this. Okay, you're not allowed to say, oh, well, we're in a different situation, we can torture, we can waterboard. No, there are no exemptions permitted. It's very pellucid about that. So the treatment meted out to these people is causing severe mental and physical suffering. Put yourself in the position of a detainee. You know, you think you're gonna drown, you think you're gonna suffocate. Don't know if they're gonna stop. They might tell you they're not gonna stop. Or even the case when they were stripped, bound, hooded, drugged and so on, wake up in a plane going you don't know where. If the hood is a bit wrong, you're going to suffocate. My goodness, you've no idea what fate awaits you when you arrive, wherever you arrive. Okay, so they were held incommunicado for months. They were, after several months, some of them were allowed legal counsel, but they were not allowed attorney-client privilege. Some of them never got to see lawyers. So it was the most monstrous abuse of the US Constitution, abrogating America's supposedly sacred rights. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was arrested in Pakistan, handed over, and he was waterboarded many, many times. Now, waterboarding is highly contentious at the best of times. To do it once, but to do it dozens of times, that's just unconscionable. A third of those waterboarded were proven innocent. I don't mean that they were not proven guilty, I mean that they were shown to be definitely innocent. So it's staggering. You think of the horrific suffering these people underwent, and you think how this really helps the Taliban and Al-Qaeda's narratives, any news America, that all this talk about liberty and human rights is all so much hot air, that really America treats Muslims abominably and all the rest of it, that there is no civilizing mission. And obviously they call this Camp Liberty. They had the nerve to talk about the operation as being enduring freedom. So Dick Cheney, remember he was vice president, he said he felt no prick of conscience whatsoever about this monstrous, cruel treatment inflicted on completely innocent people. Really, that is staggering. What a moral outrage. What a sick fiend Dick Cheney is. So many prisoners became so despondent, they really abandoned all hope of release. And what kind of life did they have there? So they attempted suicide, trying to starve themselves to death. But when they went on hunger strike, US military doctors force-fed them. Now, the United States is a signatory to a convention against force-feeding people who are going on hunger strike. In the Republic of Ireland, the United Kingdom, decades ago, doctors decided they would not do this. They considered it to be grossly unethical and unprofessional. A doctor in the Irish Republic or the UK who did this would be struck off. And so US physicians have spoken out against this. Many US military officers have said what's going on in Guantanamo Bay is absolutely shameful. So, US held citizens of its allies, including the UK, in Guantanamo Bay. It was a few years before they were set free. So the Washington, D.C. said that these people were terrorists. Prove it then. If you're so sure, put them on trial. We don't know that. You could say anyone is a terrorist. But we're too dangerous to put them on trial. Why is it dangerous to put them on trial? Why do you have any trials for anyone if it's so dangerous? It's too dangerous not to spy? What? I mean, is it too dangerous not to kidnap people? Is it too dangerous not to waterboard? Is it too dangerous not to hold them forever? This really is nonsensical. It was really the beginning of the end for freedom. So the US did put some suspects on trial, but can this be a fair tribunal? Like, the civilians tried before a US court-martial? How is that remotely fair? Held in camera and so on? And these guys think, the military officers say, well, they're my enemies, so let's find them guilty and make the US Army look good by convicting these guys. Otherwise, we've held innocent civilians for years. So if we're not sure, we'll just find them guilty. Anyway, so they don't have the same guarantees they'd have in a civilian court. Then look at the Patriot Act. So warrantless wiretapping is introduced. The US has got kind of limitless spying abroad. A completely cynical use of the word patriot, as if to imply that anyone who doesn't support this is anti-patriotic. So it's a very tendentious piece of legislation. And it's a bid by the Republicans to wrongfoot the Democrats because some Democrats cared for civil liberty and they're accused of being feeble on national security. They'll be lampooned as limp-wristed if they don't vote for this. But those who voted against were the ones who really were tough and were gallant enough to speak up for civil liberty. So there's some common sense measures the US could have taken to reduce the incidence of terrorism, such as gun control. I mean, as though terrorists never use guns. We so often hear this nonsense, oh, well, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Why don't you apply that to nuclear weapons? As a Brit, we cannot completely be sanctimonious of our human rights record. There's no limit to immigration detention. We're certainly outsourcing torture. Well, okay, I mean, the UK's record is not perfect. If you don't like it in a detention centre, you can leave any day. Say, I want to go home. Fine, you'll be on the next plane. Okay, and they're not there because they chose to enter the UK knowing you could go there. They do get released after some months, after some hearings and things like that. They're not hooded, they're not drugged, they're not chained up, things like that. They can go and play pool and play snooker and freely associate. They meet their lawyers, there's confidentiality there. So no, I think the UK's got a superb record on that sort of situation. And what was the other thing you mentioned? Yeah, torture. I mean, the UK doesn't torture people. Has it been complicit in the past? I think it has, quite a long time ago. I mean, I think it's possible to be too stringent about this because if someone else is doing torture and they give you useful information, you might as well use it. The torture's happened anyway. And if we don't, obviously it raises the risk there's an attack that you're not going to be able to prevent. Anyway, so the US could have said, we're going to have compulsory ID cards. But they haven't done that one. So the US doesn't have compulsory ID cards, as many other countries do. I mean, I don't want compulsory ID cards, but if you're willing to throw out the Constitution, you might as well introduce compulsory ID cards. The police might ask you for your driving license. Not everyone has a driving license. Even if you have one, you might refuse to show it. So there's good guy with a gun, bad guy with a gun nonsense. So there's a mass shooting incident, as there was in El Paso a couple of weeks ago, and it was, I think, 15 people were shot, 15 in 30 seconds. So that good guy with a gun is not going to have a chance. I mean, if several people are going to get killed before he intervenes, he might be one of those who gets shot straight away. Supposing I am the good guy with a gun, and I turn up at the scene, and I see a man with a gun in his hand, and I shoot him dead, only to discover that he was another good citizen trying to do what I was going to do. You don't know what you're doing. You need highly trained people. So it really is a nonsensical argument, because even law enforcement, it's always a few minutes before the police turn up. By then, it's too late for a dozen people quite easily. So... Anyway, Guantanamo Bay, where is it? It's in the extreme eastern tip of Cuba. And we know, I've already discussed how it came into America's hands. So the Cuban government has long wished for restitution of Cuban sovereign territory, and it's not happening. Now, I have to accord a lot of credit to Barack Obama. He tried to resolve this deplorable situation, have the detainees taken to the United States, and they would stand trial. If found guilty, they serve whatever sentence in the United States. If not, be set at liberty. So he deserves praise for his moral courage in trying to do this and trying to make America live up to its own boasts. But then Paul Ryan led the charge against human rights. Paul Ryan is sometimes Speaker of the House of Representatives, a Republican politician. And he said that these people were kidnapped far away, they should be held forever without any trial or charge. And shamefully, many Democrats joined him in this one. It would be too dangerous to take the United States. Okay, so they will no doubt be handcuffed, in leg irons, hooded, heavily guarded, flown to a top security prison. Is that really dangerous? The chances of escape are virtually nil. They'll be then unarmed in a country that's full of guns. This is ludicrous. What an absolute craven coward he is. We so often hear the United States as the mightiest country in the world, 320 million people, enough nuclear weapons to blow up the world 100 times over, absolutely armed to the teeth. About 60% of all military spending in the world is American military spending, state-of-the-art military technology, always pushing back the frontier of what's possible in weaponry. And yet, a few hundred unarmed guys are some sort of existential threat to the United States. This is ridiculous. The United States experiences tens of thousands of violent deaths every year. 13,000 gun deaths a year alone. 13,000. Okay, it's not going to significantly increase to this at all, even if one of them escaped, even if all of them escaped. Who knows, they want to kill anyone, probably just want to get out of there, get home. So America, so much for being home of the brave, where's your gallantry? So it shows that a large section of the population is absolutely cowardly. It's just so easily frightened. Fear creates a power structure for these securocrats and these Islamophobes whereby they can attempt to justify depriving people of their civil liberty. And who's next? They're taking away civil liberty from these people, these hostages, first of all, taking away from Muslims more generally, another religious group, another ethnic group, or whatever. So anyway, so Paul Ryan, he denied these guys a charge, saying it was a national security issue. Whenever you hear the word national security, some people just try and throw out civil liberty or common sense at that point, have some sort of ludicrous overreaction. But it was disgusting but unsurprising that he should make a mockery of America's claim to value liberty like this. So the US Congress would not fund Obama's plan. So Ryan is the kind of person who was constantly banging on about freedom. It is absolutely nauseating in view of what he was doing. He extols the US Constitution as he merrily violated it. So his stand against civil liberty and human rights was done to appease the Islamophobes and the national security extremists. So ludicrous overreaction, certainly saying they can't have a trial, they must be kept in Guantanamo Bay, can't be brought to the United States and granted their human rights. So Trump has indicated he tends to keep these people locked up in perpetuity. No thought of a trial. Now, quite a few people have been released. They've been sent to other countries for trials in some cases, like the UAE. Did they get their fair trial there? I wouldn't be so sure. So Trump has got absolutely no truck with freedom of human rights. No wonder he kowtows to the like of Kim Jong-un. Some of the most satanically cruel tyrants in the world are the people whom Trump thinks are wonderful. What else? And notice when he and those of his ilk are under investigation, how he's saying it's like Nazi Germany, despite he's the one actually locking people up without trial. Again, it's the most disgusting hypocrisy. He's whinging when the FBI lawfully and ethically carries out a search warrant on Michael Cohen. He thinks that's outrageous and totalitarian, despite him being the one who is actually behaving in a totalitarian manner by keeping people for years locked up without trial. So where does it end? It could get worse and worse. You've got to ask, how would you feel it was you, if it was one of your ethnic group or your religion who was kidnapped like this? You'd be shocked. So it's not acceptable if it happens to others. So people are still there in Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, as they called it, Camp X-Ray. And I remember hearing the guards had to say honor bound, and the other guy would return to defend freedom. Okay, honor bound to defend freedom. Well, then you have to give people their rights. You have to grant them their fair trial. Isn't that ground zero for civil liberty? The right to a fair trial. You might say, in an exigent situation, we'll lock people without trial. Okay, but internment can't be permanent. If it was a couple of years, it might have been tolerable. When it's gone on for so long, 17 years, it is intolerable. It's becoming the new normal. It exposes America's claim to stand for liberty and human rights as being a sick joke. So will these prisoners ever have their rights respected? Unfortunately, I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. There might be a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress who are brave enough to do the morally right thing. But anyway, I wouldn't hold my breath. So I require donations to sustain this channel. Please give most liberally. I don't mean that in a political sense. Apologies, Who's Been Held for 17 Years? Prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, 2002, some of them picked up in Afghanistan and elsewhere. I'm a tour guide in London, so hire me for that. Direct message me. I teach people online lessons in all humanities subjects, including French, interview preparation, give people advice on schools and universities in the UK. So I'm your man. Okay, goodbye. Look me up on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.